Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gladstone, and I am the very proud Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. It is my pleasure to welcome you all tonight and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, a virtual book launch for Dr. Tudor Parfitt's new book, Hybrid Hate, Conflations of Anti-Semitism and Anti-Black Racism from the Renaissance to the Third Reich. This is the third in the museum series of lectures curated by Dr. Parfitt entitled Black Lives in a Jewish Context. Tonight's program is presented by the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, in partnership with the FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and Books and Books, and is co-sponsored by the Ruth K. and Shepard Distinguished Lecture Series, African and African Diaspora Studies Program, and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program. And we thank everyone for their participation this evening. Few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will take the form of a presentation by Dr. Parfitt, followed by a conversation with panelist Dr. Albert Huaku, and we will conclude the program by taking questions from the audience. Please put your questions into the Q&A box where they will be organized and presented by our education director, Luna Goldberg. Dr. Parfitt's book is available at Books and Books, and we will put the website for Books and Books into the chat section. So put your questions into the Q&A, but look into the chat for the Books and Books website, and also for the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU website to see some of our continuing programming as we strive to be the best possible virtual Jewish museum anywhere, but certainly here. Now, let me introduce tonight's panelists for our program. Dr. Tudor Parfitt is a distinguished professor of the Florida International University, and we're very proud to call him the academic director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. In his review of Hybrid Hate, John L. Jackson Jr., Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, has noted the following. Tudor Parfitt, one of the most innovative and provocative scholars in the world working at the intersection of race and religion, has crafted an insightful argument about what he calls the two fundamental racisms of the West and their intertwined conceptual, philosophical, and polemical histories. Hybrid Hate is an engaging and sophisticated and disheartening examination of identity-based hatreds past that has implications for how racism and anti-Semitism operate as twinned antipathies in the present as well. This is a book that I will use in class and that has reshaped some of my own ideas about how race thinking infuses culture and society. Joining him in conversation later is Dr. Albert Huaku, Director of Ethnography and African Diaspora Religious Graduate Program and Associate Professor of the Department of Religious Studies at FIU. And as I mentioned earlier, Luna Goldberg will be moderating the Q&A portion of our program. We couldn't be more proud of our academic director, Dr. Tudor Parfitt, and so at this moment, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce him, Dr. Tudor Parfitt.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be with you, even though I can't see any of you at this point. Let me start. The murder of 9 African Americans at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston in 2015, and the murder of 11 Jews at the Tree of Life synagogue 3 years later in Pittsburgh were no doubt similar events. However, the ancient racial hatreds which provoked them, on the one hand, the racial hate and murder of Jews, and on the other, the racial hatred, murder, and enslavement of Africans, which together add up to the main objects of Western racism, have usually been considered as profoundly different. Scholars who've devoted themselves to the field of anti-Semitism have rarely engaged in the field of anti-Black racism and vice versa. In Towards the Final Solution, George Lapham Moss, the great American Jewish historian, noted that these two racisms existed in separate geographical spheres. In the 18th and 19th centuries, in Great Britain, for instance, with its great overseas empire, there was a good deal of hatred of Blacks and little hatred of Jews, about whom little was known. In parts of Europe, such as Germany, the Habsburg Empire, or Russia, where Blacks were relatively unknown, Jews were hated, and no one bothered too much about Blacks. One of the greatest writers on anti-Semitism, the French historian Léon Poliakov, considered that the European hatred of Jews and Blacks occupied entirely different psychological spheres, had little, if anything, in common, and were expressed by completely different people and for completely different reasons. Similarly, if I can just draw an example from my own country, the United Kingdom, the Labour leader, with whom I'm sure you're more or less familiar, Jeremy Corbyn, apparently feels strongly that anti-Black racism is a terrible thing, but doesn't conceive of anti-Semitism as being anything much to do with genuine racism. His understanding of racism appears to be mainly defined by ideas about power and color, and his attitude towards Jews and Israel appear to frame them in a world of privilege and whiteness. Racism and anti-Semitism seem to occupy different spheres of Jeremy Corbyn's brain and the brain of many other people. I hope Jeremy Corbyn reads my new book, but somehow I don't think he will. What I'm arguing in this new work is that, in fact, anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism are not merely similar, but have been in constant moving dialogue for centuries. In medieval Europe and in the early modern period, the demonization of Jews and Blacks ran in parallel. For thinkers of the Renaissance, such as Paracelsus or Giordano Bruno, Jews and Blacks were considered outside the usual human framework. And the idea began to spread that Jews and Blacks had origins and founder events that were quite separate from the rest of humanity. Thus was born one of the most potent aspects of racism, called polygenism, the idea that not everyone was descended from the loves of Adam and Eve. By the 1820s, even Goethe had no hesitation in proclaiming that Jews and Blacks had different founding events from Europeans. There were many other similarities in the way that Blacks and Jews were imagined over time, and I described them at some length in the book, but mostly what they had in common was their position as radical outsiders. Then something odd happened. And here I'm going to pause a little, and you will forgive me if I digress for a second or two. when I wrote, as it was, the first book about the saving of the Ethiopian Jews back in 1985, and later when I discovered and wrote about the Lemba, a Black Jewish community in Central Africa, I was mystified by the massive international interest in this topic. The story provoked first-page articles in newspapers throughout the world, and my own work made it to 60 Minutes and generated a number of documentaries on the BBC, the History Channel, PBS, and elsewhere. I didn't really understand why it was that the conjunction of Black and Jew should trigger such an incredible response. I went on to write about the phenomenon of Black Jews more generally in a book which I wrote for Harvard University Press back in 2012, and for which Books and Books did a very nice launch, which I remember very well. But in that supposedly kind of comprehensive book, I missed something. And that something that I missed proved to be critical for what I think will be, moving forward, our understanding of the evolution of race theories, and was the catalyst for this new book, Hybrid Hate. So this was the thing that I missed. In 1777, I read in a German book, published a couple of years later, a slave from the west coast of Africa recounted to a German missionary on a Caribbean island that in the small kingdom of Loango, you can see Loango on the map, his home country, there were Black Jews, 1777. And according to the missionary who wrote this text, they kept the Sabbath, they didn't eat with the local Negroes, as he called them, and had images of snakes and lizards on their tombstones. Now, this in itself could be extremely parochial, but not any huge sort of international interest, were it not for the fact that the theorists and scientists of the time, the scientists of the Enlightenment, who effectively created the modern world, leapt upon this seemingly incredible story, the discovery of the existence of these remarkable Black Jews, because it suggested to them many fundamental things about the new science of race, including the fact that Jews could possibly come in many different colors, including pitch black. As the years passed, travelers kept finding new Black Jewish communities in different parts of the world. This is towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And these Black Jews also supported this notion of a multicolored racial group. And the Jews that were discovered were in Waregla in the Sahara, where an English traveler found Jews deeply stained with Negro blood, as he put it, in Timbuktu, in Libya, in the Jordan Valley, in Bombay, in Cochin, in Ethiopia. And this played into a growing conviction on the part of race scientists that Jews and Blacks, in fact, had the same origins, that Black blood literally flowed in the veins of Jews, and that the skin of supposedly white Jews was actually Black, even if it kind of looked white. So from 1777, the date of the discovery of the Black Jews of Loango, until round about 1850, these Black Jews played an absolutely critical role in the great race wars of the time between polygynists, who believed that many different races in the world had different founder effects, founder events, and monogenists, who, of course, believed that all mankind are descended from the same founder event, as these Black Jews appeared to offer proof of climatic determinism. In other words, the great debate was whether these different groups in the world who had different founder events could change over time or not. And the argument of the polygynists was that no, race groups are unchanging, immutable. They can never change, and they will never change over time. And this was the essence of racist thought in the 19th century, and it was the essence of racialist thought and racist thought in the first half of the 20th century as well. On the other hand, you had the liberals, if you like, on the other side of this great race war, who believed that no, it's that groups can change. It's a question of essentially a question of climate. Skin tone, which was the key thing here, was a minutely studied subject in the 19th century. One of the greatest authorities on pigmentation was the Englishman John Beddoe. He'd served with distinction in the Crimean War, in the British Field Hospital, made famous by Florence Nightingale, and while he was there, did a physical anthropological study of the skins of the multinational population incarcerated in the hospitals of the Dardanelles. He subsequently went on to analyze the eye and hair colors of the peoples of Europe, and thereby laid the foundations of the great pigmentation surveys, which would be carried out in Germany and elsewhere in Europe in the last decades of the 19th century. One of his achievements was to create a meticulously annotated index of negrescence of the population of Great Britain. On this index of negrescence, Jews scored fully 100% on his negrescence index. In other words, in his view, and to use his terms, Jews were 100% Negro. One of the largest pigmentation studies, which involved nearly 7 million school children, was carried out in Germany shortly after German unification in 1871 by the distinguished German scientist Rudolf Virchow. The teachers were provided with a set of instructions which required the children to stand in line with the blondest haired children at one end and the darkest haired kids on the other, in a continuum of hair color. This way, the children learned that there was a hierarchy of color. Skin color was shown in the study to be a function not only of what was visible, but also of the relationship between hair and eye color. Visible skin color was in fact of no importance for the study. Children were asked to roll up their sleeves to reveal the color of their arm beneath their clothes, which would be unaffected by the effect of the sun. In other words, the skin color that you perceive with your naked eye was not necessarily the real skin color of the individual. For that, you would have to have some specialized knowledge and training and partially undress the subject. And there were scientific ways of determining what skin color actually was. Now, the period at which this extremely important study was done was exactly the moment when finally the Jews of the German Empire had finally achieved emancipation. However, it was also the point when the hatred of Jews, which for the previous many hundreds of years had been expressed in social terms, or perhaps in religious terms or perhaps in economic terms, was now being expressed in a very different way. It was being expressed in racial terms. And this was the point at which a new chapter opened in Jewish history. One of the catalysts for this development was a very strange character called Wilhelm Ma. In 1879, Ma, who is known as the father of modern anti-Semitism, introduced the term anti-Semitism, hadn't been used before, into the political lexicon of the world. Ma started his political life as an anarchist, extreme left. He had no particularly anti-Jewish views when he was a young man. And in fact, he had 3 Jewish wives, one of whom he absolutely loved to distraction, along with her friends and her family. So it was curious that he should have become the great anti-Semitic figure of the 19th century. In fact, it was during an extended trip to North America that Wilhelm Ma learned how to be a racist. He'd seen black slavery in action in the United States and elsewhere. He was in Nicaragua as well, and wholeheartedly approved of it. He loathed black people. His contempt for blacks was soon transferred in his mind wholesale to Jews. What the Americans did to the blacks, Europeans should now do to Europe's blacks, the Jews. And so, filled with the views of the racist thinkers of the time, such as the embittered Scots physician Robert Knox, or Joseph Arthur Gobineau, the French aristocrat who helped develop the theory of the Aryan master race, Ma argued that the blood of the despised Negro flowed freely in the veins of Jews. Jews really were somatically, as well as metaphorically, the blacks of Europe. Over the next few decades, from Ma's time until the time of the Third Reich, the ancient streams of anti-Jewish hatred on the one hand, and the hatred of black people on the other, joined together in a mighty and unstoppable torrent. Even before the rise of Nazism, the equation of Jews and blacks had already started to a very large extent. It had started to fill the media of the time, the newspapers, and so on. Theodor Fritsch, the well-known German publisher of the anti-Semitic magazine Hammer, for instance, stressed the sexual danger to Aryan purity of both blacks and Jews. He explained that Jews' unfortunate characteristics could best be explained by their partially African ancestry. And this became absolutely the common ground of European racists over the next 20 or 30 years. Among them were the acclaimed French novelist and Holocaust denier, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, who went even further than Fritsch. He considered Jews to be entirely and absolutely African. He said, "Le juif est un nègre. La race sémite n'existe pas." The Jew is a Negro. The Semitic race doesn't even exist. Nazi and fascist race theorists embraced these ideas enthusiastically. There was a broad consensus among Nazi and Italian fascists, and particularly among their physical anthropologists, that black people, like Jews, were utterly inferior and that there were marked Negroid elements in Jews. This image here is very typical of the time, and it shows a kind of conflation between blacks and Jews, confronted with the racial purity of Europeans. In this particular case, a young Italian girl who clearly is being seduced by the joint efforts of a black and a Jew. And it's worth noting that in this image, you can see horns on the black, and these indicate, and have indicated for hundreds of years, the idea that Jews have horns. So this is not merely a black, this is also a black and a Jew, and the objective of racial pollution is one in which Jews and blacks both engage, but in fact they become one in this enterprise. In the years before the First World War, these ideas were already present as well in the United States, as they were in Europe. The Ku Klux Klan regularly lumped blacks and Jews together, as did many American race theorists. In 1910, Dr. Arthur Talmadge Abernethy, a very well-educated man, loved by the authorities, author of some 50 books, published a remarkable tome called The Jew, a Negro. And Abernethy in this book stated categorically, time and time again, that the Jew of today, and I'm quoting, as well as his ancestors in other times, is the kinsman and descendant of the Negro. From a Nazi point of view, blacks were visibly colored and needed no other signifier. Jews were not always visibly, but they invariably did have internal, invisible Negro blood, and their apparently pale skin color was often, in Nazi terms and views, often illusory. Jews also had other somatic Negroid characteristics, but whatever they looked like, Nazis were convinced of the need to rid Germany both of Negroid Jews and, of course, also of Negroid, of Negroes, black people themselves. As is well known, in just the same way as the beginning of racial anti-Semitism in Germany and in Europe in the 1870s and 80s was inspired to a considerable extent by what had happened in the United States in terms of discrimination of black people. So it was the inspiration in the 1940s and 1930s, I beg your pardon, for the discriminatory legal codes enacted against Jews, blacks, and others by the Nazis. And they were based to a considerable extent upon the American Jim Crow laws, which discriminated so cruelly against African Americans. The main problem with the overall American racial legislation, however, from a Nazi perspective, was that officially the Americans didn't include Jews in the category of coloreds. There were blacks called coloreds, and there were people who were maybe white, but they had one drop of black blood and they were considered to be colored. But the Jews were not included in this category. But in 1934, Roland Freisler, who later became the presiding judge of the Nazi People's Court, as he was mulling over how American regulations against blacks could be used in their war against the Jews, it was that actually American legislation could be used as it was. It didn't really need very much modification, simply because, as he put it, and I quote, any German judge would reckon the Jews among the coloreds, even though they look outwardly white. As illogical, frenzied, and neurotic streams of Judeophobia and Negrophobia clashed or ran together or in parallel to create this Rassenwahn or race madness, it emerged that blacks and Jews as an indivisible entity presented the greatest threat to white Aryan civilization, not only in Germany, but throughout the world. Hitler argued that Germany was threatened by blacks and had been deliberately negrified by the Jews, whose intent was to weaken and destroy German society through racial and cultural contamination. So this is another image which shows precisely in graphic terms. Here you have a pure Italian classical head, and on it you have a black stain with a Star of David in the, and the cultural threat to Aryan culture in this particular case. It has to do with decadent music, Entakte Musik. Here you have, the idea was that things like jazz were entirely a black Jewish phenomenon, and that this form of music was actually designed to destroy Western Christian culture. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote of the Jews, systematically, these Negroid parasites, the Jews, in our national body, corrupt our innocent fair-haired girls and thus destroy something that can no longer be replaced in the world. On a visit to the Auschwitz concentration camp with the Paris-based Aladdin project in 2011, I was struck by the sophisticated modern facilities which had been available for the daily ablutions of the SS and other German personnel, and by the total absence of such facilities or of soap or of clean water for Jews. Jews, barely able to wash, were rendered black and filthy in comparison to the gleaming cleanliness of their persecutors. The contrasting visions in Der Stürmer and elsewhere of black and dark Jews and spotless white Aryans had in Auschwitz been made flesh. Here we have a particularly striking slide from Der Stürmer, which shows somebody with a stereotypical Jewish profile menacing a white Aryan girl, except for the fact that he is black. So if, following Virchow's method, an Auschwitz victim's sleeve had been pushed up to reveal her true color, his true color, an eloquent black number tattooed on the grimy skin of the outer or inner left upper forearm would have been a reminder of the alleged color of the Jew. Thank you very much. And I think we'll now go on to a discussion with Albert. I beg your pardon.
Okay. Good evening to all, and thanks for the opportunity to engage Professor Parfitt on this very, very important work. Let me first of all congratulate Professor Parfitt on a very thoroughly researched, cogently argued, and easy to read work. And I think it's going to make an invaluable contribution to studies in multiple fields: history, religious studies, political science, studies on violence, anthropology, African studies, Jewish studies, studies on race relations, and the list can go on and on. But more importantly, in the light of contemporary developments in the area of race relations in the USA, this is a very timely work. And I will say that it's a must read for every scholar in the humanities and the social sciences, and general readers seeking to unravel the core issues in race and race relations. Certainly, it's going to make a big splash when it hits the shelf of bookstores. So thank you, Professor Parfitt, for providing us with this work. My first issue or question is, and that's out of curiosity, can you tell us what inspired this work and what went into its writing? Did you have a specific target audience in mind who you were writing for? Did you have any large issues, social, political, global, or local, that you were trying to speak to? That's my first, question regarding your production of this very important work.
Question, Albert, and I suppose really, I'm a Jewish studies guy, and so my, the kind of the audience that I kind of imagine is always going to be that sort of fraternity of Jewish studies scholars, I suppose, but also the wider Jewish community, and beyond that, the wider community. And the thing that led me to writing this book was the absolute astonishment that I felt when I discovered that this remote little Black Jewish community in Luango, about which nobody had ever written and which no Jewish studies individual had ever considered for a second, and which had never entered the pages of history, had had such a huge, massive impact upon race theorists. And then as I was reading, the physical anthropologists of the first few decades of the 19th century, I could see that the general discourse was beginning to change in this curious way, and all of a sudden there was a conflation of Jews and Black people in this literature. And I could very easily have finished the book sort of probably at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't really my intention to bring it into the modern, or at least into the 20th century, into the Nazi period. That wasn't the original idea at all. But, as I was writing the book, gradually things became clear to me that this thing was going on. It hadn't stopped at the end of the 19th century. It kind of went underground in a sort of a way, but then it emerged. And so the kind of polygynist ideas which had dominated the discussion of race probably from the 17th century through to the end of the 19th century, that emerged again in the Nazi period. And yeah, so thank you. It was a good question.
And thank you for the response too. One impression that a reader gets from reading this work is that Western racial hatred for Jews and Blacks is not necessarily founded on facts, but constructs, ideologies about others that aren't necessarily true, but born out of, let's say, ignorance, or deliberately profit to further political agendas. And over the years, we have been bombarded with evidence to the contrary, evidence that contradicts these ideas. For example, Jews, we have come to note, excelled anywhere their global dispersals took them to. They made monumental contributions to civilization. They have been behind advancements in science, humanities, social sciences, in places like the USA. And we can say the same of some African people. And we would expect that in the face of this evidence, attitudes will change. But that's not so. We have had all these new hate groups proliferating, and their targets have still been Jews and Blacks. So can we speak to why these negative racial attitudes have endured over the years, despite these obvious contradictions? Is it the same old fear? What is behind racial hatred? Generally, is this something about the human condition? That makes people fear and hate each other, despite the evidence that is on the ground.
Well, I mean, it's an amazing thing that, in the medieval period, there was a great deal of hatred of all sorts of people. It was savage beyond belief in many respects. And one might have thought that with the Enlightenment, these ideas would change or disappear. But that's not at all what happened. And, it's extraordinary. I mean, you're absolutely right to talk about the immense success of Jews in terms of their contribution to the modern world. And yet in the 18th century, it was deemed more or less impossible that Jews could ever actually contribute anything to modern German society. And in the same way that, of course, at the time, Black people were being sent across the Middle Passage as slaves to the Americas, there were countless plans and projects and books devoted to the prospect that maybe the same thing could happen to the Jews, because they couldn't do anything useful in Europe. So, this is the thing. You mentioned sort of political agendas. Well, I mean, in the case of Germany, particularly in Germany, and perhaps the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, France to an extent as well. By the 19th century, Jews really were more or less absorbed, and they kind of were assimilated into these societies very, very thoroughly. And in a way, a kind of mechanism had to be found to prevent this absorption going on. And so a mechanism was needed that would make a clear distinction between between Jews, all blacks come to that, and other Europeans. And the thing that was discovered was blood. The one thing that can't be changed. Somebody's religion you can change. Somebody's social habits you can change. Clothes you can change. Blood you can't change. If the idea is that these people are utterly and completely and totally different because of their racial constitution, it means that they are beyond the pale. So racial hatred, I think we have to make a distinction between racial hatred and the kind of hatreds that existed before the beginning of what I call the racial age. Now, the racial age, in my terms, is a period that starts at the end of the 17th century and has persisted until now. I'm probably one of the very few people in the world who thinks that despite everything, we're coming towards the end of the racial age, but I believe that to be the case. And it's very interesting that during this period where race is becoming the thing, it's becoming the means of understanding the world, it's cutting edge science, it's the thing that smart people are kind of subscribing to and reading about. And yet, what it does time and time again throughout this period of 200 or 300 years is to take ideas from the Dark Ages with respect to the difference of Jews or all blacks and just paint it in different colors, in kind of racial color. One example, let's say, is that both Jews in Europe, ever since the medieval period, and blacks in the Americas, but also in Europe, were thought of having a particularly noxious, horrible smell. And, you know, this was part of the hatred of Jews and blacks. And many reasonable and liberal philosophical characters would, in the 18th century, say, well, this is ridiculous. You just go along to a Jew and sniff. They don't smell bad. They smell exactly the same as everybody else. Or go to and anyway, the racial scientists, particularly towards the end of the 19th century during the Nazi period, they actually set up whole kind of scientific research programs to try and analyze these, the particular features of the Jewish smell, which was so repellent to European Christians. Or if you take the old canard that black people are somehow associated with apes, and often there was a similar thing that Jews too were associated with apes, very frequent in 19th century race thinking, or goats, that was the other thing. And some of the most sophisticated, really sophisticated kind of racial scientists of the 20th century were still playing around with these kind of ideas about goats and about monkeys and about apes and things, to the point that that one of them, a guy called Montaudoin in France, kind of established an idea where there were four major races, grand races he called them, all of which went back to a different kind of monkey. And the Jews, one of the reasons for the fact that the Jews were different was that they had their very own kind of ancestral monkey. The whole thing was completely barking, to be honest. And even within the, even within the terms of the of racial science as it was in the 19th century and early 20th century, physical anthropology, it was as it was understood by the people that studied it and taught it and knew about it. what the Nazis were doing and what the racial scientists of Germany from about 1925 through to the end of the war, they were completely and utterly barking. They were nuts. It's no other way of putting it.
Thank you. I had a third question, but it looks like the moderator is signaling that it's time for the next, portion of the program. So I had a number of issues I wanted us to talk about, but we'll find time and do that, later on between the two of us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Albert. I look forward to discussing it again with you at some other point. And thank you for the questions, and thank you for being here.
For joining us. We're going to transition to the Q&A section of this program. And so, Tudor, we have a first question for you from Sharon Lipton. And her question is, if Christians were followers of Jesus, Jesus was born and died a Jew, how do they reconcile that fact and anti-Semitism?
Well, it's a good question, and I can't really say that I know the answer to it, and it's not entirely the subject of this book. But somehow, the idea of Christ was kind of transformed into a well, first of all, Christ was transformed into a European. If you just look at any of the art of the Renaissance or even much earlier, there's no particular suggestion that Jesus has got anything to do with the Middle East, let alone Africa. And so a division was made between the people's individual understanding of Christ as somebody like them, Europeans were in the image of God, and God therefore looked like them, and that's what Jesus looked like in terms of the popular imagination. Jews, if you look at the, there are some extremely interesting recent works which look at the margins of prayer books in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And you see images of Jews in the illustration in the margins of these Christian prayer books in England and France and Germany and so on. And it's very interesting that in these marginalia, in these little illustrations, the Jews don't look anything at all like other Europeans. Very often they're black, by the way. But, so this black thing started a very long time ago, and I deal with that in the book. And in fact, if you look at the cover of the book, there is an image of Jesus going to the high priest Caiaphas, and behind him, and Caiaphas and Jesus are white, but behind him there are clear Jews. They've got a kind of stereotypical sort of profile, but they're black. So, I think the Jews were just imagined in a completely different way to Jesus, and of course they'd had the opportunity to listen to the message of Christ, and they had rejected it, and this was their great fault. Certainly in the medieval period, early medieval period, China subsequently.
We have another question from Gigi Flores, who asks, how do the recent racial issues in the US relate back to the work you did in your book?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that, over the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, there has been a remarkable increase both in the United States and elsewhere, of attacks on Jews. So instances of anti-Semitism have grown remarkably. And over the same period, as we hardly need reminding, the same thing is true, or even much more true, of African Americans in this country and people from non-European backgrounds in Europe. So, you know, it's very interesting. I started with, you know, with the image of the attacks on these two communities on a Methodist Episcopalian black church, on a synagogue. Now, racially inspired, you don't have attacks on German churches. You don't have attacks on Welsh chapels or Scottish chapels or Italian chapels. It's always the same groups. So, I mean, I think that there is, you know, in a subterranean way, such a visceral connection in people's minds, at least in the minds of racists. And in a recent book, Sander Gilman, who's really one of the greatest scholars in the world, working in the areas of race and blacks and Jews, he entitled his last book as a question, "Are racists mad?" And I think it's a question that we really have to consider. And it's not only kind of, you know, sort of racist frothing at the mouth, it's enablers and looking around at states and governments and individuals and people doing the most abhorrent and the most irrational and the most extraordinary things. You have to ask yourself the question, are they mad? Is it actually a form of madness? And I think there has been some recent work done by psychologists, which is beginning to frame these things precisely in the area of mental illness.
Thank you. Our next question is from Yonatan Elazar, and he asks, in his book, Jews and Blacks, Jonathan Schorsch claims that Sephardim were confronted with their own blackness, and this is one of the reasons they were in the slave trade. How could the enslaved Jews of dark skins?
I'm going to have to guess that one because the sound went.
Okay, so it's in the Q&A from Yonatan Elazar. Jonathan Schorsch claims that Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam with their own blackness, and this is one of the reasons they engaged in the African. The enslaved Jews become the enslavers of dark-skinned Africans.
Yes, I admire Jonathan Schorsch. He's a very good historian. I admire his book. So, I mean, in the particular case of that Amsterdam community, there were slaves, some of whom converted to Judaism. But there was a kind of rift, you know, between these between these converted Jews who were black and the rest of the community. It was true in Amsterdam, and it was also true in Dutch colonies, where the same phenomenon occurs. And essentially the problem here is this, that Jews in Amsterdam who may have wanted in that particular society to be thought of as part of a wider, very cultural society, they wanted to be part of this, they knew that they were not considered the same as everybody else. And one of the things that they were very, very clear about wanting to be was white. They wanted to be white. And any kind of association with members of the community who were not white, I think they found very, very problematic. It seemed to be drawing attention to a part of the community that they had absolutely no interest at all in encouraging. At least that's part of the answer to the question.
Thank you. From Marianne Elric, we have a question. How do Arabs fit into this story? Are they, and therefore Muslims, conceptualized as a connected Afro-Semitic and therefore Black community?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's a very interesting one, because, well, put it like this in kind of, wider terms. The main others of medieval and early modern Europe were undoubtedly, on the one hand, Jews, who were the kind of internal other, and then there was a kind of external other, who was the Moor. And the Moor was not particularly conceptualized in terms of color at this point, a bit, but it was not a reproach necessarily. And it wasn't really, I don't think it was really a full reproach until after the beginning of the racial age. But gradually the idea of Moor and Blackamoor, black, sort of combine. And I mean, in contemporary terms, let's say, if that's really the object of the question, I mean, how do Europeans, relate to Arabs or to Muslims or to people of Arab background or Muslim heritage living in their midst? Is there a racial element to it? Yes, I'm sure there is a racial element to it, and it's partially to do with a darker color tone, and it's partly to do with history, a very long history of antagonism around the Mediterranean between Moors and Muslims and Christians, and of course one feels echoes of this all the time.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rose A, and she asks, have there been any pushback from the Jews, maybe those from Israel even, of this categorization of being Black?
Well, I'm not really saying, Ruth, that they are Black. I'm just saying that they were constructed as Black in this long, in this long racial discourse. I suppose in a way the takeaway here is that I think is that the point at which these two different streams of rank racial prejudice combined, the combination was somehow very much more powerful than if they had never been combined. It was the point at which Jews were racialized in the way that they were racialized that eventually led to the I think to the period of the Third Reich and the Holocaust. It is largely very significantly to do with the racialization of Jews over the period of the 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th. I'm not actually saying that Jews are black. I'm not saying that. That's not the point of the talk, and it's not the point of the book. And in any case, people's colors are of no interest to me at all. I couldn't care less what people's colors are, right? It doesn't make any difference to me. But it did make a difference to them. And they acted on the basis of this very, very curious sort of playing around with ideas and constructions of, you know, turning white people into black people.
Our next question is from Bonita Sussman, and she asks, does the decline of racism shown towards Blacks have anything to do with the rise of philo-Semitism that we find globally? I'm asking for a reverse theory.
So let me just look at that question if it's written down. Does this connection have a bearing on noticing? Does the decline of racism shown towards Blacks have anything to do with the rise of philo-Semitism that we find globally? Right. Well, I'm not really aware of very much decline in terms of racism towards Blacks. I think that's the first thing. I think that racism towards Blacks over the last 4 years has been all too evident in this country. So it's difficult to understand where this question is coming from. And similarly, I've got slightly more sympathy, I think, with the idea of philo-Semitism being an important feature of contemporary life. It's not all about anti-Semitism. That's absolutely true, but there's an awful lot of anti-Semitism around. That's equally true. I think I was quite taken by a friend of mine who's a local rabbi who gave a talk at the Jewish Museum right at the beginning of this year, and he made the very, very good point that it's very difficult to talk about anti-Semitism, but it is possible to talk about anti-Semites. And this, I think, there's a truth here. Anything that is overtly and obviously and absolutely anti-Semitic as a policy, let's say, is not something that is going to really attract large crowds, nor is it something that's ever going to be incorporated officially in anybody's program. If it did, they'd be closed down. And the same thing goes with, you know, official, I suppose, anything that's anti-Black and sort of officially so, there'd be a lot of pushback, a great deal of resistance on the part of people both in Europe and in the United States. But anyway, I think, yes, there's a lot of racism.
Thank you. And for our final question of the evening, it comes from Sydney Gill, and the question is, do you feel that anti-Semitic rhetoric in the US is growing more prominent, or has it always existed alongside anti-Black rhetoric?
Well, I find it very difficult to believe that it's it clearly isn't worse now than it has been in the past. I mean, that's clear. If you were living in the United States before the Civil War, and if you read the the stuff that was being written in defense of slavery and which denigrated black people in a million different ways, there is nothing like that happening in the United States today. What there is today, I think, is a kind of remnant of those attitudes that were formed in the 18th century and 19th century here and elsewhere. There are remnants, vestiges, shadows, but they're still incredibly potent, and they affect all kinds of aspects of daily life for Black people in this country and elsewhere in the world. There's no question about that. But it's not as bad as it used to be. Similarly with Jews, I mean, it's perfectly obvious that in Europe things are not as bad for Jews as they were during the Third Reich. I mean, there is absolutely no question about that in any sort of way. So things are a lot better, but they're still not good. Unfortunately, in the same way that sort of Enlightenment and 19th century kind of supposedly modern ideas were actually very often carriers of medieval ideas, which were extremely repugnant, and they were kind of put in new clothes. So, this is happening today to a large, to a certain extent. So, there are lots of old fashioned, outmoded ways of thinking about people, which which kind of creep into both policies and discourses and conversations, attitudes, and unkindnesses, and so on. As everybody knows, through jokes, little stories, and all of the other things that put together create racism.
Thank you, Dr. Parfitt, and thank you to all of our panelists this evening. Thank you all for joining us. And if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, I've just put the link to Books and Books in the chat. If you enjoyed this program, please also consider joining us next Monday at 12:30 for our next program, Reframing LGBTQ+ Rights as Human Rights. All of these links are in the chat, and we hope to see you again soon.